All right, so we're here with Nathan Kehler. He's our Executive Director of Canadian Research and Mapping Association, and they've worked on a really awesome project called Project 44. So thanks, Nathan, for doing this first interview. Um, I wanted to basically make some interviews so that people can learn a bit more about mapping projects from people who have actually done mapping. So I guess before we get started, Nathan, do you want to tell us like a bit about yourself or about CRMA, just for people that don't know anything about what we're looking at?
Yeah, sure. So the CRMA is a not-for-profit organization based in Ottawa, Canada. We've existed for about 4 years now, and our specialty is mapping, basically military history. That's kind of our niche. Myself, I was in the Canadian Army for about 13 years. I specialized in making maps for the military, um, and then I just have a really extensive history, or sorry, interest in history. So that's sort of how that plays into what I currently do.
Cool. So yeah, so for those that don't know what Project 44 is or never seen it, what's your kind of like couple lines or kind of your brief description you give to people if you have to tell them about it?
Yeah, that's always tough. Like, how do you give a brief description? But basically, we map out the Second World War. Um, we kind of give people the ability to look at any portion of the war and kind of see where the front line was, and potentially read about what the Canadian units were doing at any given day.
Yeah, super cool. It's a really fun map to look at, and it's really interactive. So we'll definitely have links everywhere for everyone to check that out. So I guess first question is like, how'd you come up with this idea? Like, where did it come from? What's the story behind that?
Yeah, I don't sort of inception over a long period of time. Um, just looking at maps and they often only focus on key events, but what happens in between doesn't really usually get talked about.
Hmm.
So I was working at the Library and Archives Canada with a colleague, and we were looking at Canadian war diaries, and the war diaries are just a daily log of events that happened throughout the day, and they were written for every day of the war. And inside these war diaries uh, were descriptions of where these units were. So maybe it's a grid reference, maybe it's a relative reference, like we are outside of this town. Um, so my colleague and I thought, well, we could probably map all this out. What would that look like? So we did sort of a little test, and we realized that 95% of the units of the Canadian Army we could map out. We thought, well, how cool would that be if it was
Hmm.
online, right? Because then
Hmm.
you can zoom in on any day you want and just find out what happened.
Yeah, it's yeah, there's so much data. So I guess, jumping into that question is like, how much work was it to put together the data and like where did it come, like how did you get it out of where, you know?
Right. So the project's probably best thought about in three distinct projects. So the first was sort of the trialing it out, which was based on the D-Day invasion. That was 90 days. Um, and then we had two more subsequent projects after we realized we could do this. Um, but it was a very massive project. It took about a year for us to map out the first component, and then about a year to do the second and third component. And it all comes down to actually, there's two sides of things. There's a series of situation maps that we use. So we geo-referenced a daily situation map across 90 days, and then we plotted all these positions from that map. And then for the Canadian units, we actually used their war diary and an old topographic map from the Second World War, and we manually plotted out the exact positions where these units noted where they were. So it's very labor intensive, but it was an interesting project for sure.
Wow. Yeah, I think one of the things I run into a lot is people underestimating how much work data is. People kind of just assume that like that data is out there somewhere, and the amount of work you actually had to go into, and obviously your history with maps made that much more possible. And you kind of have to be a specialist with maps to do what you were doing, or was it something you could have trained someone else to do?
You could probably train somebody to do it. It's not rocket science, but you do need to have a good understanding of how to do it, of how military maps work, and then how to read those grids. Um, not impossible, but there is a bit of a learning curve to it for
Mm.
sure.
Yeah,
Um,
interesting. So you mentioned you had a partner working on this with, was it just the two of you? And were you kind of both in the same specialization, or did you split up responsibilities differently?
yeah, so my colleague Drew Hannon helped out with all three projects. I I probably more focused on the actual geographical side of things. Drew focused heavily on the war diary side of things, but he definitely helped out map different components for sure,
Mm.
especially at the situation map level. And then he also managed approximately, over 3 to 4 years, we had about 40 volunteers help out with the war
Wow.
diaries because there's a whole other contextual component for the war diaries of OCRing and turning it into actual text from these old documents.
Mm.
That's like a whole other sort of like project within the project. Um, yeah, so definitely a lot of work.
Yeah, it's kind of a sign of a project that's actually doing well is that it spawns more mini projects and it kind of just never ends. It's cool you have all those volunteers, but yeah. So I guess going back to, okay, so after you had the data, like how did you figure out, like how did you get started on the web development side of things?
Yeah, well, so um, I'd always had an interest in digital maps because I think it's really the best way to map anything. Uh, Democratizes it, passes it, so anybody can see it. Um, I think my first big foray into it though with Mapbox was the Iwo Jima map that
Hmm,
you helped me work on
hmm,
5 years ago or so.
hmm,
Um, and just kind of going through that, I'm not a natural developer in any sense of the form. Um, so it was a lot of, is this possible? Can we do it?
hmm.
Talking to you and saying, oh yeah, I think it is possible. So yeah.
Cool. What were some of like the early, I don't know, like early things you learned when you started doing developing or mapping? Like, are there some things that kind of stand out that you didn't know about before, or just early lessons about developing in relation to maps?
Wow, there's so much I've learned for sure.
Hmm,
I wish I'd learned more, but um, Mapbox Studio, I would definitely say I didn't know what I was doing to begin with, but I would definitely say I'm an expert in Mapbox Studio
hmm,
now.
hmm,
Uh, Learned a lot about GeoJSON, how it works, how to convert it, how to upload it, um, and then a fair amount about JavaScript. Through some of the story maps we created. I'm definitely not an expert at all, but
hmm.
uh, there's definitely a huge learning curve that I've seen myself go up. If I look back in the rearview mirror, like wow, I have really come quite a ways.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. I mean, being the developer for your project, I always regard you as a much more like technically competent client compared to a lot of other clients who just hand over data and don't want to get their hands dirty or even things like working on code. That's something that you do a lot more than the average client. So I imagine a lot of lessons were learned around coding. And I know we had a lot of things with formatting. It's kind of this eternal issue of like
yes,
just getting the formatting just right, which is one of those very painful things if you're not the developer, right?
some of the best lessons are learned the hard way through just absolute frustration and late night emails. Why isn't this working? And oh, because you did this one really silly thing, and then
Mm.
just that feeling of stupidity. It sucks for a moment, but you'll always remember that from now on, right? So
Yeah, super good for people to know that that kind of like feeling dumb or screwing things up is not a sign that you're doing things wrong. It's just part of learning, and and you got to get through it to make your project work sometimes.
yeah, for sure.
So I guess next question is like after the site kind of got going, you got it started, you kind of had a first version ready. How did you start publicizing it?
Yeah, so early on, we put a lot of emphasis on social media. It's really the best way to get out there. We started on Facebook, uh, you know, email signups, that kind of stuff. We had a really lucky break on LinkedIn. We had a video, very basic video that
Mm.
my colleague Drew developed, and it went viral. It had like 1 million hits, and it goes viral every couple times a year. People
Right.
usually kind of rip it off and and we get a couple more followers. So that really helped out a lot. And then, lately Twitter's been a big impact for us, trying to get more followers that way. But you have to have sort of a social presence, whether you want to or not. So
Yeah. So from your bit of analytics or knowledge, like who are the main users of the website? Like, do you have different types of users?
yeah, that's an interesting question. I just did a big survey actually, sort of biased towards whoever subscribes to our email, but definitely Canadian as their main source,
Hmm.
and then followed sort of by countries that are, like the UK, the US, and Netherlands and France. So sort
Hmm.
of biased towards those countries. That's where the project takes place. Those are the countries mostly affected by uh, the Second World War, after D-Day, and where the Canadians were involved.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so sweet. Yeah,
Interesting. Yeah, I remember that one time that we started getting a whole bunch of hits from Poland, and you were
right,
asking me like, "Are these legit? Like, what's happening? Is this a site attack?" And then we found out that it had gone viral in some message board in
right.
Poland, which was really cool to see. Stuff you don't expect, right? Um,
Yeah, it's always neat to discover where, all these people might come from at any given time.
Yeah. So I guess along with who your users are, do you get a lot of comments or like a lot of people emailing you with questions, or like are they angry sometimes? Like what's the response you get like directly from people?
Mostly positive.
Hmm.
Sometimes people get angry because they felt that, a unit from maybe their country, right, a specific country is not properly represented, or maybe there's data wrong. Right, we have 150,000 points of data. There's errors in there from us for sure. It's just the way it is. There's errors there from the source documents, and it's an imperfect system for sure. So yeah, we get some crusty emails every once in a while, but mostly positive.
Awesome. Do the comments at all help you to like expand the map or have new ideas?
For sure, there's more good ideas than we can possibly deal with in any given time.
Hmm.
um, and it's always easier to it's really easy to come up with a good idea.
Hmm.
It's really hard to implement that. So it's difficult to manage people's expectations. If they're frustrated if something isn't the way they expect it to be, it can be difficult.
Right. That makes total sense. That's the mark of a successful project again, is suddenly and it's really easy to go to burnout level if you try to keep up with everybody's ideas. That's what I found. Um, I guess, so what are some of the ideas you have for the future of this map, or like what kind of stuff should we look out for? Are there other side projects related to this that you're working on, or what's coming up?
Yeah, so we have one sort of side project. It's called Forgotten Fronts. It's just more about Canada during the war at home.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so a big component of that will be what we call the home front. So war production, women in the workforce, like what
Hmm.
was that like? Because that was a big change, where women were going in the workforce. Then there's some darker parts of history that people forget about. So if we think about Japanese Canadian internment, right? That was big in British Columbia.
Hmm.
Um, People often think, oh, it was, maybe it was sort of, Japanese that were interned, but it was not like the Japanese Canadian term. I don't really like that. They were Canadians, right? They
Hmm.
were Canadians. They were citizens, and they were interned. So we want to talk about stuff like that because the war, while it was mostly fought in Europe, it had a ton of elements that happened back at home. It could even be pilots training for war who never made it to the war, who died in a training accident, because that happened
Well,
all over the place. So
huh.
those are the kinds of things we want to talk about. And in the future for Project 44, I mean, we always, me, Victor, I have like bold visions, right? Um, Really, to me, the future of Project 44 is sort of like an open street map,
Hmm.
Wikipedia style model where we open it up to the world to map out uh, the sort of, I don't want to say the problem with Project 44. Like, the thing is, the way we currently do Project 44, it's just a couple people that can map,
Hmm.
but the war is massive. So how do you map all that? So to me, you need to open that up and allow the world to map, because there's so many little experts along the way who
Hmm.
know these little things, and we want to tap into that.
Oh, that's super exciting. I'm just psyched hearing about it. Like the idea of opening it up and developing that whole kind of system for how do you moderate it, but really just making it a crowd effort is so good for future generations too who want to know about this. I guess one other question here is however much you want to talk about is like, how do you get funding or how do you get supported to do all this? It's obviously a ton of work.
Yeah, so we've been very fortunate for our last 4 projects. We've been funded by Veterans Affairs Canada.
Hmm.
Um, but now we're going to have to look at different ways to go moving forward. So that's something we're currently exploring, whether it's a crowdfunding approach or uh, different ways that we can do that. So
Cool.
a not-for-profit organization is always difficult. That's one of the hurdles for sure.
Yeah, no doubt. So any little lessons or tips or things you might want to tell to other people who are starting map-based websites or are kind of working on them? Just any kind of, morals or lessons that you picked up?
I don't know. There's lots of great websites out there that I like to look at. And, there's people I like to follow on Twitter just for inspiration, like
Mm,
Johnny Walker. He's always creating crazy maps on Twitter. So I like to follow that kind of stuff just to see what's out there.
mm,
But I don't know, Mapbox, I really enjoy it because whenever there's something crazy that I think of, I'm like, hey, Victor, do you think we could do this? I'm like, well,
mm,
I don't know, but let me look. And usually we can, right? So when as I'm not a developer, you know, uh, but like a GIS person, I look at Mapbox and then I look at sort of the competitor like Esri.
mm,
Esri has out of the box things, but it's so corporate and they're very commercial,
mm.
and you have to have like a lot of technical knowledge, right? So like that's really like about Mapbox. It's super open. So many different cool things you can do with it. So
Awesome. So yeah, just the last thing is how do people follow you?
Twitter's the place to be for us right now. I know everybody thinks Twitter's on fire, but we post a lot of daily content. So if you're
Mm.
interested in the Second World War or history in Canada, we post content daily.
But that well, thanks for joining me and thanks for doing this first interview. Super fun, super great to know all this information. So thanks, Nathan.
Thank you for having me.